All right, everybody. Let's go through the process of actually setting up our view. I think that this is the appropriate time to talk about that, since now we're starting to develop some entourage. The important thing to know about setting up your view is how much to model, right? We have a building right now that is, if I'll ever get it to load, it's really just our site. And how many times have you guys tried to develop a model and you've only had to model the site that your building is on? How many times? Like one time? Is that what you said? Or all the time? Every time? You've only had to model the site that the building is on to develop a rendering. Well, you guys have like huge sites for most of your projects here. But if you take a look at like that building up there, right, at the top, that building pretty much takes up the entire site, just like ours does. So it's really difficult to position yourself on a spot on the site and get a good view of the building. We're going to try it, but it might not work out well for us. So let's go into our site plan view. And I think you guys have seen this before, where you're trying to position someone and then you create a view. We did it for our cover image, right? So we're going to do another one, and this one's going to be specifically for rendering. Pick the camera tool under View, 3D View, and let's go all the way out to the absolute corner of our site, and we're going to try to develop a rendering that looks at the whole building. Okay, so this is us standing right at the corner of our site. That's about as much as I could see within what Revit tells me is the acceptable field of view, meaning anything outside of that perspectively is going to get skewed. You guys know that principle? No? No. Okay. Well, someday I'll sketch out with you guys like how to actually hand draw perspectives, and you'll see what I mean. For instance, like Zaha Hadid, her perspective drawings like really accentuated the what do you call it? The warping of perspective in order to create really interesting geometries. But anyway, so what happens is if I start pulling this thing way out to the left, these elements start to look absolutely massive, right? This thing looks like it's probably, 10 feet wide in comparison to this wall, which is really like 20 feet, right? So that's the skewing of perspective, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's used for artistic effect. But that's what happens when you start to skew these things. So I actually kind of like this image right here. For some reason, it turned out really well. So this is a terrible example, but it's a terrible example. Let me try that over. So let's do an example of one that's a little more extreme, maybe. Okay, so let's put ourselves like let's put ourselves in a position where we're kind of walking up to the building and we're about to approach the entry, someplace like right here. So I'm trying to look inside the building and see the entry itself. So now I want to see the building above it, but I also want to see the rest of the building to the left. There we go. So this is a good example of where the perspective gets far too skewed. Does that make sense? And you've seen it when you're scrolling in and out in Rhino and stuff like that, changing your field of view. That's what that does. So you want to be careful about that. Revit does kind of preset it to the acceptable, I think it's 60-degree range, 30 on each side, is generally what our eye perceives. So just be careful about that. Anyway, let's move on. So I actually kind of like this, so I'm going to stick with it. Let's work on this as our rendering. I'm going to do a little panorama render. So anyway, let's change this thing to a realistic view. So this is preliminarily what our rendering is going to look like. It's not terrible so far. I think some of the materials could use work. But yeah, I'll probably change a few things. But anyway, what you guys notice is there's a whole bunch of empty stuff back here, and I need to populate that. If I'm going to create a good rendering, I need to build out the site behind it and make it look reasonable. Maybe it's another house, or maybe it's like a hill, on a hillside. I'm not sure. I need to make that happen. We also need to figure out what to do with this side of the site over here, which luckily I think I just need to develop a little grass strip, and in the background probably something like right back there in that little edge, I'll put a little tree and that'll pretty much cover it. Okay, does that make sense? So picking a good point of view, this is your, I mean, most of you have taken the rendering class with me. All those same principles apply. You have to pick a good point of view, and if there are gaps in the model, you need to model it out. So let's set up our render settings. Let's go to, well, do I want to just do it as a different video? Let's do it as a different video, actually. In the next video, I think we'll set up our render settings. Any questions on this so far? Just setting up your camera? We didn't do that much in this one. Just talked a lot.